All right, in this series on an introduction to apologetics, we're continuing our look at the historical case that can be made for the resurrection of Jesus. In the last episode, we said that that case will involve two basic steps. The first step is to establish those strongly attested facts that will serve as the historical evidence. And then the second step will be to show that the resurrection of Jesus is the best or most probable explanation for those facts over and against any rival hypotheses. Now, in this episode, we are going to focus on the first step. Here, we will briefly review 6 well-attested historical facts, and these facts will serve as our evidence, and these are the facts which must be accounted for by any historically credible hypothesis. Now, as an aside, there are more facts than just these 6, but in choosing to focus on these 6 in particular, I am specifically relying on the scholarly work of Gary Habermas, Mike Licona, and William Lane Craig. So what are those historical facts? Well, let's list them here, and then we will return and look at each one in more detail. So the first fact is that Jesus died by crucifixion. The second fact is that the tomb of Jesus was found empty by a group of women followers on the first day of the week following his crucifixion. The third fact is that on separate occasions, different individuals and groups had experiences of seeing Jesus alive from the dead. The fourth fact has to do with the origin of the Christian faith, which depends on the belief of the earliest disciples that God had raised Jesus from the dead. The fifth fact has to do with the fact that the church persecutor Paul was suddenly changed. And the sixth fact has to do with the fact that the skeptic James, who was the brother of Jesus, was also suddenly changed. Now, in this episode, we'll briefly review the first 3 of these facts, and then we'll look at the final 3 in the next episode in this series. So let's start with the first fact, that Jesus died by crucifixion. It is popular on the internet these days to question whether Jesus Christ actually existed, but scholars who specialize on the subject know better. That Jesus really lived and that he met his death by crucifixion are facts that are acknowledged by nearly every scholar who studies the subject. There really is no scholarly debate about this, and for good reason. The crucifixion of Jesus meets several of the historical criteria that we reviewed in the last episode. It meets, for example, the criterion of embarrassing testimony. Crucifixion was designed to be an especially humiliating way to die. And for this reason, it was reserved by the Roman Empire as a punishment for members of the lower classes, for slaves, and for traitors. Moreover, crucifixion was especially seen as scandalous for the Jews, since according to the Torah, anyone hung from a tree was to be considered cursed by God. It also meets the criterion of multiple independent attestation. Most people are aware that multiple sources within the New Testament attest to the crucifixion of Jesus, but most are not aware that several non-Christian sources of the period report the crucifixion as well. And these include people like Josephus and Tacitus. These are sources that we looked at in a previous episode. A guy named Lucian of Samosata, who was a Greek satirist, another guy named Marabar Serapion, who was a Stoic philosopher from Syria, and then also the Jewish Talmud mentions the crucifixion. Now, for these reasons and more, we ought to consider the crucifixion of Jesus a fact of history, or as the skeptical scholar of the Jesus Seminar, John Dominic Crossan, puts it, quote, that he was crucified is as sure as anything historical can ever be. End quote. So our first fact has solid historical grounding. What about the second one? The fact that the tomb of Jesus was found empty by a group of women followers on the first day of the week following his crucifixion. Although the empty tomb does not have the near unanimous support among scholars as the other facts do, it's still affirmed by a strong majority of scholars who study the subject. So skepticism about the empty tomb is unwarranted, since it too is strongly attested historically. And as we've seen, that Jesus died by crucifixion is beyond historical doubt. That his body was then placed in a tomb is also a fact that is well established historically, as it is reported early and by multiple independent sources. The historical case for the empty tomb can be summarized by 4 basic lines of evidence. The first is that Jesus was buried by Joseph of Arimathea, as Mark's gospel records. This is unlikely to be a later Christian invention, since Joseph of Arimathea was a member of the Jewish Sanhedrin, the very court that unanimously voted to condemn Jesus to death, and therefore not at all the kind of person that one would expect to care for the corpse of Christ. That Jesus was entombed subsequent to his death by crucifixion is a fact with strong historical credibility. The second line of evidence is what Habermas and Licona call the Jerusalem factor. When you think about it, it is truly remarkable that the proclamation of Jesus' resurrection began in the very city where Jesus was publicly crucified and then entombed. It would have been impossible for the disciples of Jesus to propagate the claim that Jesus had risen bodily from the dead if his corpse was still lying in the tomb. To stop the new movement, the enemies of Christianity, the Jewish leaders or the Roman officials, had only to exhume the body of Christ and to parade it through the streets of Jerusalem. And this would have effectively shattered the hoax of Jesus' resurrection if his body was still in the tomb. But this never happened. Neither Jewish, Roman, nor any other writings provide any such account, and there is total silence from Christianity's critics who would no doubt have jumped at the evidence if this sort of evidence had existed. The next line of evidence comes from the historical criterion of enemy attestation. The empty tomb is multiply attested explicitly by friendly sources, but it's also implicitly attested to by hostile sources. To counter the claim that Jesus had risen from the tomb, the Jewish authorities accused Jesus' disciples of stealing the body, a fact reported in the Gospels of Matthew and then further repeated by the early Christian writers, Justin Martyr and Tertullian. So instead of pointing to a corpse that was lying in the tomb, the enemies of the early Jesus movement claimed that the body of Jesus was stolen. And this was therefore a tacit admission that the tomb of Jesus was in fact empty. And the final line of evidence for the empty tomb has to do with the testimony of women. All four of the gospel accounts identify women as the primary witnesses to the empty tomb. Women are not only the first witnesses that are mentioned by the gospel writers, but they're also mentioned in all four gospel accounts, whereas male witnesses appear only later and in two of the gospel accounts. As is well known and well documented, both Jewish and Roman cultures of the time considered the testimony of women to be questionable at best and of second-class value to the testimony of men. So, given the low first century view of women, it seems highly unlikely that the gospel authors would have made women the primary witnesses to the empty tomb if they were inventing the narrative. If they wanted people to believe their story, they certainly would have chosen men as the primary witnesses rather than women. The fact that women are the primary witnesses in all four Gospels lends very strong credibility that this is exactly how it happened. Thus, the fact of the empty tomb is further certified by the historical criterion of embarrassing testimony. So for all these reasons and more, the late Oxford historian William Wand insisted, quote, "All the strictly historical evidence we have is in favor of the empty tomb. And those scholars who reject it ought to recognize that they do so on some other ground than that of scientific history," end quote. Okay, so we have two well-attested facts. What about the third one? That on separate occasions, different individuals and groups had experiences of seeing Jesus alive from the dead. Incredibly, this is another fact that nearly every scholar who studies the resurrection of Jesus accepts as historical. In other words, there is virtual consensus among scholars that subsequent to Jesus' death by crucifixion, his disciples really believed that he appeared to them, risen from the dead. As Habermas and Licona point out, the reason for the near consensus among scholars who study the subject is because of the strong historical data, which establishes that, quote, one, the disciples themselves believed that the risen Jesus had appeared to them, and two, subsequent to Jesus' death by crucifixion, his disciples were radically transformed from fearful, cowering individuals who denied and abandoned him at his arrest and execution into bold proclaimers of the gospel of the risen Lord. and they remained steadfast in the face of imprisonment, torture, and martyrdom, end quote. So following Habermas and Licona, we can organize the historical data into evidence that the disciples actually did claim that they had seen the risen Jesus, and into evidence that the disciples sincerely believed those claims. The fact that Jesus' disciples claimed he rose from the dead and appeared to them meets several of our historical criteria for credibility. The claim was reported early. It has multiple independent attestation and occurs in multiple forms. There are, in fact, 9 early and independent sources for the post-mortem appearances of Jesus to the disciples. And we can organize these 9 independent sources into 3 general kinds of sources. The first general source is the Apostle Paul. Paul tells us that the disciples taught and proclaimed that Jesus rose from the dead and that he appeared to them. Since Paul personally knew some of the apostles, including the 3 central apostles, Peter, James, and John, what he has to say about them amounts to first-hand independent testimony. The second group of sources is from the oral tradition found within the New Testament. As we've seen in a prior episode in the series, several New Testament writers included creeds, or easily memorized theological statements that were circulating in the early Christian community in oral form within their writings. These creeds are obviously earlier than the New Testament letters that contain them because they existed as oral tradition before they were written down. One of the most important of these creeds is one that we've already looked at in a previous episode in this series. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 3 through 7, Paul writes this, quote, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the 3rd day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles." End quote. Here Paul is passing on a creed to the Corinthian church, which relates 5 distinct appearances of the risen Jesus to individual disciples and groups of disciples. It's actually 6 appearances if we include the appearance of Jesus to Paul, which he includes in verse 8. And these appearances took place in different circumstances and at different times. Now, notice that one of the appearances mentioned in this creed is to more than 500 brothers at one time. And to this, Paul adds, quote, "most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep," end quote. This statement from Paul comes across as a challenge. He's essentially saying, don't believe me? Go talk to the witnesses yourself. Most of them are still alive. Now, as we saw in a previous episode, this creed here in 1 Corinthians 15 is very early, going all the way back to within months to just a few years of the crucifixion of Jesus. The New Testament also includes oral tradition in the form of sermon summaries. Most scholars believe that many of the sermons in Acts that proclaim Jesus' resurrection and appearances reflect prior oral summaries that can be traced to the earliest teachings of the church, and they provide another independent source for the claim of the apostles to have seen the risen Jesus. A third kind of source comes from written tradition. Of course, here we include the 4 Gospels in the book of Acts: Matthew, Mark, Luke, Acts, and John. Now, as we've seen in a previous episode in this series, no matter how skeptical the critic might be concerning the Gospels, it is well accepted that all 4 Gospels were written during the 1st century while many of the eyewitnesses were still alive. Although there appears to be shared source material among the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, each of the 4 Gospels independently attest to the appearances of the risen Jesus, and therefore they should be considered as 4 independent sources for the disciples' claim. 2 more written sources come from the apostolic fathers and associates of some of the apostles, Clement of Rome and Polycarp of Smyrna, both of whom we have also met in a previous episode in this series. So these 9 sources point to multiple early independent testimonies to the disciples' claims of having seen the risen Jesus. So we know that the disciples claimed that the risen Jesus had appeared to them. But how do we know that they were telling the truth about their experiences? What is the evidence that they actually believed what they were claiming, that they weren't lying, that they weren't making it up? After Jesus' death, the lives of the disciples were transformed to the point that they endured persecution and even martyrdom for their claims. Compare the attitude of the disciples before and after the appearances. Before Jesus appeared to them alive, they were cowards. They fled at Jesus' arrest, and they hid during his execution and burial, with the exception of the Apostle John. And after the appearances, the disciples boldly proclaimed the risen Jesus in the face of heavy persecution and a threat of death. This radical change in the strength of their conviction indicates that the disciples were not lying when they reported that Jesus rose from the dead and appeared to them. They weren't lying to receive some kind of a personal benefit. As virtually all scholars who study the subject agree, the disciples really believed that the risen Jesus had appeared to them. The fact that the disciples endured persecution and death for their claim that Jesus had risen from the grave is also strongly evidenced. There are 7 independent ancient sources that testify to the willingness of the disciples to suffer for their proclamation that Jesus rose from the dead and appeared to them alive. Those sources are the Book of Acts, Clement of Rome, Polycarp of Smyrna, Ignatius of Antioch, Tertullian, Origen, and Eusebius. Now, Eusebius himself was relying on an early 2nd century writer named Dionysius of Corinth for his information. These 7 sources testify to the willingness of the original disciples to suffer and die for their faith. Now, if we include the sufferings and martyrdom of James, the brother of Jesus, and the Apostle Paul, the number of ancient sources increases to 11, adding Paul, Josephus, Hegesippus, and Clement of Alexandria. Now, to be clear, the fact that the disciples were willing to suffer and to die does not make their claims true. That's not what we're arguing here. The point is simply this: their willingness to suffer and die is evidence against the idea that they were lying. In other words, the disciples sincerely believed that they had seen the risen Jesus. So the evidence that the disciples claimed and sincerely believed to have seen the risen Jesus after his death is extremely powerful, which is why no other fact is as widely recognized as this one is. Of course, some critics will argue that what the disciples actually experienced was hallucinations or visions, and we'll examine the hallucination theory in a later episode. But nobody who studies the subject denies that the disciples actually experienced something, and that they believed that that something was an appearance of the risen Jesus. As a leading skeptical scholar, Gerd Ludemann writes, quote, "It may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ," end quote. The fact of the disciples' claims and beliefs that they had actually seen the risen Jesus has far-reaching implications. Habermas and Licona draw them out when they write, quote, "Since the original disciples were making the claim that Jesus rose from the dead, his resurrection was not the result of myth-making. His life story was not embellished over time if the facts can be traced to the original witnesses. Moreover, if the direct witnesses really believed that Jesus rose from the dead, we can dismiss contentions that they stole the body and made up the story. In fact, virtually all scholars agree on that point, whatever their theological positions," end quote. All right, so that's the first 3 historical facts. We'll look at 3 more next time.